packet pushers.
Welcome to the IPv6 Buzz, where we dare to dive into the 128-bit address space wormhole. I'm Ed Horley.
And I'm Nick Buraglio. We discuss everything IPv6 on the show, from strategy, design, deployment, operations, and even internet standards.
And I'm Tom Coffeen. We've spent 20 plus years working with the IPv6 protocol. We work on getting IPv6 working.
And we're here to share some lessons learned and how to avoid common mistakes. We're glad you joined us. 2025 is going to be a year of change for IPv6. Welcome to 2025 first show. And I guess we should start off with the first big announcement, and that is that the IPv6 Buzz has a new co-host, Nick Buraglio. Hey, Nick, welcome to the show, man.
All right. I'm super stoked to be here. Very happy.
Yeah, we're stoked to have you.
Yeah, very, very cool.
I appreciate that.
In addition to Nick being on board, it's going to be a big year, I think, for IPv6 in general. And I think the reason why is that many reporting sites that report on sort of internet traffic, if you follow the trends, this is going to be the year that the majority are going to see things sort of cross that 50% threshold. And I thought that would be useful to sort of talk about what impact that will have for 2025, if we really think that's super important or not. I don't know. We can sort of see if that's really a major milestone or not. You know, for the majority of folks, what does this really mean for most users? Is this really like a truly significant thing, or is this just sort of like, okay, nothing really changes in my day-to-day life in regards to how that's going to play out and what's going to go on and things of that nature? So I guess there's probably two different camps: the general users and then those that are in the IT profession. I think for general users, it's not going to change much, right? They're already using v6 and they probably don't know it, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's all under the hood for them, and they're not going to notice anything different. They may hear folks in the IPv6 camp crowing a little louder about IPv4 being the legacy protocol now. It's official, but I don't know how much meaning that has for them, you know, in terms of day-to-day activities online and performance and what they're going to observe and notice.
Right. It's like the rest of the world complaining about the fact that the US uses imperial units and not metric.
Yeah.
No one in the US cares.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that I like the breakout that you gave there of the IT professionals and then the general users. And I think you're probably spot on. Like, general users are already doing it, right? They just don't know it. And that's the mark of something that's been done well, right? Is that the change has happened and no one noticed.
Yeah, that's right.
Practitioners, I think, from my point of view, which is completely biased, is that crossing that 50% threshold adds an air of legitimacy that is pretty irrefutable at this point. You know, once it's over 50% in a consistent manner, then it's really hard to argue that it's like fringe, or nobody does it, or no one asks for it, or I'm never going to do it on my network, which maybe that's true, but that last one at least. But I think that it's pretty hard to point at that and say, oh, it's over 50% regularly or consistently, but it's still never happening, right? I think those two things, they're incongruent.
Right. With that in mind, does this really change anything, though? I mean, does it change things for a practitioner who's trying to figure out the landscape of what they're doing? And if it does change things, what does that look like for them?
I think you could even further break that out into verticals, right? So like, you know, the finance vertical is probably not going to do IPv6 on their PCI network if they don't have to. They might front end all of their user interface stuff with a CDN that does v6, which would give them a v6 presence for their users to connect to. But, you know, I think there will be varying levels, you know, kind of like we've already seen, right? There's varying levels of, we're going to do this here, but not here, or now we need to start thinking about it,
right?
Kind of behavior, depending on what your risk level tolerance is, I think is what's going to determine that.
Yeah, I think part of it's going to come down to what you do as a business, right? So to your point about what category you sort of fit in. And if your business is to be on the internet and sell services on the internet, I think you're going to be highly interested in having both v4 and v6 available to you to maximize what you can do and what you sell. I think if you have a tremendously large set of backend infrastructure that you use and manage to run your business, but it isn't necessarily required to, you know, be on the front side of the internet and to provide those services there, then maybe you're a slower adopter than those that have to be out there on the front end selling. So I think that there might be some differences in terms of the services you provide and what you're doing. And then, you know, obviously what markets. If you're selling to the federal government and you don't have v6, you're probably going to be in a world of hurt here pretty soon in terms of complying to, you know, be able to allow you to continue to operate working on projects. So I think that's a really important point. Well, I guess looking into 2025, this tipping point of crossing the 50% threshold, which I really, for a lot of the stat reports, I'm primarily looking at US numbers. There's international numbers that exceed that. So, I mean, if you're in India or in some other country locations, they're well past 50% in terms of IPv6. And so that's already done. But, significant for the US market, that's, I imagine, where most folks are listening for the podcast. Google's getting to 50% global V6 usage, which is the probably more interesting sort of number to me. It grows about, I don't know, 3, 4, 5% per year. And I think that's sort of the interesting side of it, is that the overall trend for imbalance in terms of looking at the total population, you look at the total population of the planet and where most folks are living and operating, and then you look at the V6 adoption. V6 adoption is actually higher within those population centers. And so that's also another interesting trend. I think that's partially because of the service provider mobile market, right? And how much they've been able to penetrate IPv6 into the mobile side of what's going on. There's just more eyeballs that are using V6 to be able to see traffic on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's really important. So if you're on the other side of that, if you're a CDN or a content delivery, or you're selling or dealing with any of that sort of stuff, being on V6 becomes more and more important to you as a business model. And I think that's a big factor for a lot of folks that changes. I don't know how many enterprises fit in that category, right? It's important for them to interface because they have end users that are using these mobile devices to connect to their network. And obviously that's something that is going to fit into their both security parameters and how they want to control their network, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know how much that impacts them maybe upgrading or changing their internal infrastructure, which would be slightly different than just making their services available or leveraging third-party services to make their services available on V6. I think that's a more nuanced thing. I'd be really interested to see if anyone's actually reporting stats on that.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anyone break that out in any sort of way that's useful, that really gives insight, partially because it's really hard because people aren't sharing their data, internally about what they're doing that way, right? It's not something you commonly see.
Yeah. And I wonder, just to sort of throw a wrinkle into the equation here, to what extent, when we talk about IPv6 adoption reaching a certain level and surpassing, say, 50%, and then to what extent are we going to put a requirement on what we consider the progress of IPv6 that is related to the decommissioning of IPv4? The networks that are all IPv6 today, that, you can point at mobile networks where they've managed to create IPv6 only in a pretty significant way. And that's in countries like India, where that's like one provider is able to jump that number up to 60+%, level of IPv6 adoption. That's an instance, though, where it's pretty much IPv6 only. But to the extent that IPv4 is still running on the network, does that sort of change the assessment of what we consider to be, progress around IPv6? For me, I think the answer is kind of, as an IPv6 diehard, it's kind of like, well, I can see the outlines of an IPv6 only sort of future for networks, but in terms of the eternal question of where enterprise is with IPv6 and then where they have adopted IPv6, is it IPv6 to the point where they can decommission IPv4? And I think generally, the answer is no, is resounding no.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate assessment. V4 isn't going anywhere anytime quickly in terms of, I think it's just going to decline steadily over time. There'll still be continued use for it. It's still practical. And don't have the wrong impression. Just because you're listening to IPv6 buzz doesn't mean that IPv4 isn't useful.
Right.
Right. A lot of the internet runs on it today. So I think you'll continue to see that. I just think if you want to innovate in interesting ways and you don't want to have your hands tied in the way that IPv4 from a resource constraint problem ties you, then maybe you take advantage of the unique opportunity that V6 provides you in terms of maybe redesigning, redeploying, and rebuilding your architecture. And that's a rare opportunity, and maybe more than enterprises are willing to bite off and chew at this moment in time, right? That's a bit of a scary project for a lot of folks. That's not a trivial sort of undertaking. It's like that perennial, when do you want to completely remodel your home and gut it all the way down in order to rebuild it to have something better on the other side? And if you're living in it, it's not so appealing to do that process. If you can move out and live someplace else and then move back. So maybe after everyone makes their transition to cloud, Tom gets all their services, they're like, okay, we can rebuild our house now. And then they'll rebuild with V6 and see if it works better.
I like to think about it as almost like a language, right? So IPv4 is obviously it's still there. It's still got uses, it's not going away anytime soon. I always think about it as like the decline of speaking Latin, right? Latin was prolific as a language. Now it is a dead language. IPv4 is no longer being, there's no enhancements, there's no standards changing for it. It's essentially like, it's done. We're all done with this. If you want to innovate, you use this one, which is IPv6. And I think, Ed, I think you've mentioned it before, like realistically speaking, we're still going to have it for a while.
Right.
And it's okay to speak it, but like, why not be bilingual? Learn the other one as well, because that's the one where all of the innovation and the changes and, updates and features are happening.
I think that's a really good point, is that certainly knowing V4 and knowing the capabilities of V4 and being fluent in it is still useful and will continue to be useful. And I will never tell someone not to learn IPv4, but I will tell people to learn V6 because that's where things are going to. And like you said, being bilingual and understanding both V4 and V6 is just going to be more useful throughout your career. I think there was a great disservice in the V6 community of 20 years ago, everyone saying the sky is falling and that you have to learn V6 right away in order to sort of address these need requirements. I think we've all realized that that was a mistake in terms of communication and messaging, and that trying to move people over at that time has served to be an impediment to adoption today, because you get the continual statements of like, well, I heard this was a problem 20 years ago. Why are you telling me it's a problem today? It wasn't a problem then. It's still not going to be a problem in another 20 years. I think their assessment is probably incorrect now.
Yeah.
And the problem is trying to point it out when you have, tangible proof that they can point to, right? I can point to the thing that says that this is, the cat has a paint stripe down it. It's not a skunk. Right.
But as you suggest, you can make that argument, and for sure we can quibble about how relevant it was to sort of make that argument historically, but it's not a bulwark against the listener's need potentially to learn IPv6 and to be able to be conversant with it, to be able to deal with it in an operational environment, at least sufficiently to the point where they can, recognize, sufficiently to the point where they can not break the network and not have problems as a result of not understanding how it works. But, more ideally, obviously take advantage of some of the function and features that are there.
Yeah, I guess that turns to the next thing, which for the audience is, will this impact what you guys do day to day, what your company might do, what you have to deal with in the near future, right? Does us crossing this threshold really impact anything? Maybe it does in terms of articulating to business leaders where the internet is today, right? In terms of impact, influence, maybe the footing of saying like, hey, more than 50% of the internet traffic is IPv6 today. We might want to consider at least having a transition mechanism to allow our end users and us to participate on more than the majority of the internet. I think is a reasonable argument. I think there's some weight to making that. Does it change anything about what you might do within your company? I think learning V6 becomes incredibly important, so that if your management team does come down, or there's compliance requirements that do come down that say that you need to get it up and operational, that you're not starting from zero. It's very difficult, and it takes some time to be able to understand, have good design architectures, and be fluent in V6 in a way that allows you to take advantage of everything. You can absolutely band-aid it in. Don't get me wrong. I've worked on projects where, a month later we had V6 up and working and doing the thing that needed to happen for that organization to function. Was it the best in terms of address planning and how they're going to see going forward and how they're going to grow and everything else? No, it didn't take into account any of that. It was get it up and operational so that you can participate on the V6 internet to be able to meet a stated requirement that was urgent, right? And yeah, you can absolutely do that. And I'm not saying that you can't, but I think more planning, better understanding, better architecture is going to serve you and your company better over the long term. And I think that's really should be where people think about it more carefully.
I won't pretend to be able to think like a CIO, but the idea that, okay, last week, IPv6 was at 49%, and I was ignoring it. This week, IPv6 is at 51%. Do I continue to ignore it based on that additional 2%?
Yeah.
So to what extent is that the psychology of, because let's be honest, for most organizations, for most enterprises, for the CIO level, IPv6 is very much still sort of a risk management proposition for them. Like,
Sure.
how do we manage the risk of, if we don't adopt it, what risk are we incurring? And, where could that bite us in the future? But if I'm like an AI CIO where it's like, 49% versus 51%, time to act. I don't know. It's kind of could go either way on that one.
I think you hit on something very important there, Tom. It's a psychological shift. My hope is that the simple psychology of it being the majority, if it's 51%, if you own 51% of a company, you own the company, right? If you're using 51% V6 for all internet traffic, the majority is V6 traffic. So I'm hoping that there's a mind shift that happens even subconsciously. You know, it's not like someone's flipped a light switch, right? Like, hey, we've gone from 49 to 51. It's not a binary thing, but my hope is that there's a psychological trigger that happens there that says it's now the majority. I can't really ignore it. Maybe it's still low priority, but like it's not zero priority now. I would call that a pretty big win, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it does have some impact in terms of maybe it's a change of the tone of questions that you get. So it's more along the lines of, well, are you comfortable being in the minority around accessing the internet today? And just reframing the question to individuals like that of saying, like, oh, are you comfortable being in the minority in that particular instance where you're trying to reach the broadest audience? Like your goal as what your company, not all companies are trying to reach the broadest audience, right? But there's going to be, a handful that operate that are like your whole goal is to try and reach everyone, right? To reach the broadest audience possible. If you're not participating in IPv6, I don't understand how you're reaching that goal. It's very simple. That would have been true prior to this 50% threshold crossing over.
That's right.
It should have been true, at 15%, right? If we want to reach everyone, we probably should be addressing all parts of the market. So I don't know if that's really going to change the metrics for them. It might be interesting to see if there's a bigger market change for retail, for healthcare, right? Healthcare folks have to reach everyone. Maybe the political side, they're supposed to be reaching everyone, even though we don't want them to reach us. So there's that aspect of it. So I think there's some things that could happen there. Let's shift gears a little bit. We have the great advantage of having Nick on the show. And one of the things, hopefully the audience is going to find out in a hurry here, is that Nick happens to be one of the co-chairs for the IPv6 working group for IPv6 ops and the IETF. And that gives us some unique insights maybe into some of the things that are happening in the IETF. So maybe you give us a little bit of overview of V6 ops versus maybe 6-man, and then what's important, what's going on, what's happening, and maybe you can give us an idea, just the big picture things of what the IETF is tracking and why.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I've been the co-chair of the V6 ops working group for 18 months now, I think, something like that. Seems shorter, but I think it's been about that long. Within the IETF, there's a whole bunch of different working groups, and a lot of them are sort of tied together or related or whatever. Within IPv6, there's two really that are sort of front and center IPv6 focused groups. There's the 6-man group, which is 6 maintenance. That group handles sort of changes to the core protocol. So for example, if you wanted to add another flag or something,
Extension header, something of that. Yeah.
extension headers, just changing the protocol. People have probably heard me come on here and talk about the RFC 6724 update that's been sort of in progress for several years. That's a change to how source address selection happens. So it's core protocol. That's within the 6-man working group. So that's a good example of one that sits very squarely in that working group. The working group that I'm co-chair of is the operations working group. So it's meant to handle more operational issues, provide guidance and best practices and things like that. So for example, we're in the middle of publishing, and so this kind of goes along with, what's going on this upcoming year. We're in the middle of publishing a draft that lays out essentially almost every option you can think of when it comes to neighbor discovery, specifically how to secure it and, what things may come up that you may need to think about when you're deploying IPv6 from a neighbor discovery perspective on all kinds of different mediums, wireless, wired, it's a very comprehensive document. And that's what's called an informational RFC. I mean, that's, I think, in the process of IESG, which is like right before it goes to publication.
Right. Is this a return of send? I'm just joking.
No, no. So that document will provide guidance, right? Operational reference. That's the V6 Ops working group. And we've got a page up that has, what our milestones are for the next 2-ish years. And we can link to that in the show notes for people to look. If you just scroll down to milestones on the V6 Ops working group page, you can look at what's sort of in there for still 2024 and 2025 and 2026. So we did just recently publish the DHCP prefix per host RFC. So that published out of V6 Ops. People can read that. I think that's potentially useful for very large scale Wi-Fi deployments specifically, but also folks that have Android devices may have interest in that because Android will almost certainly support that particular blend of DHCP. We're working on hop by hop draft that is in the final stages. And for 2025, we have a plan to do more informational drafts on deployment and operations. So just help out, provide guidance on real world deployments is the plan. So that's slated for 2025, as well as some changes to CPE requirements. So this is an update to an older RFC 7084. That's in Shepherd write-up right now, which is right before it goes to IESG, which is, like I said before, the final stage before publication. So that'll change the way that like ISP CPE handles certain things. It fixes a couple of problems and updates it to be sort of relevant in today's landscape. So there's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, there's also some drafts on V6 mostly considerations. Full disclosure, I'm a co-author of that, so shameless self-promotion. But that's one of those things that's sort of gaining momentum, and it's good to have some documents out there that you can read that sort of highlight what you got to think about.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of conversation back and forth with the mostly about what works, what doesn't, and what scales, what doesn't, right? And so I think the goal of the document is really to help encapsulate some of that learned knowledge from actually trying it out and testing it at events and things of that nature to really sort of determine what's appropriate for folks to use. Because there's a lot of options. It can get very confusing if you're looking at all the options about what's available out there and be like, well, which one actually works, right?
Yep.
Because you can get something to work, but does it actually scale and does it solve the problem that you're trying to actually solve for? Very cool. Well, I appreciate the update on that. In terms of show links, we'll provide a bunch of links around sort of the current adoption statistics so folks can look that up. And then we'll also provide the one on the IPv6 milestones. I guess I just want to say, Nick, welcome on board. We're really thrilled to have you, man.
Yeah, welcome, Nick.
Super stoked to be here. Like, I woke up real early today, excited.
Very cool. All right. I really appreciate everyone sticking around for 2025. We look forward to really talking more V6. Thanks for joining us for this episode of IPv6 Buzz. If you've got feedback or follow-up on this topic, send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU, where FU stands for follow-up. We'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
Also, at packetpushers.net, you'll find a range of other deep dive technical podcasts for IT pros.
There's a whole lot more on the Packet Pushers site as well, such as tutorial videos and a community Slack channel where you can talk with industry peers and experts. So whether you're deep in your career or just starting up, Packet Pushers is the place to go to grow both your skills and your personal network.
And until next time, we'll see you on the IPv6 internet.